You are all very welcome to this seminar called Everyone Can Communicate. My name is Margaret Tolley. I am a strong advocate for people with intellectual disabilities and have a passion for issues like supported independent living, employment, and many other issues like supported independent living, employment, and many other issues impacting people with intellectual disabilities. I have worked on lots of projects with Inclusion Ireland and have spoken at joint Oireachtas committees and the UNCRPD committee. I have lived experience of intellectual disability. I am happy to be here today to introduce this seminar. Decision making is so important for people with intellectual disabilities. Often people presume that we can't make decisions for ourselves. This is not true. I have a voice and I can use it. Some people with intellectual disabilities communicate in ways other than with words. Just because they communicate in a different way doesn't mean they can't make decisions. Everyone should be able to make their own decisions. No one else has the right to say what other people want, need. And you can suggest things, but it just has to be the person who makes their decision. It does not matter if the person can speak or not. They still have the right to make decisions. Some of us need support to make decisions. We might need our families or our friends, and that's okay. Everyone in the world needs support. So welcome to everyone. I am looking forward to learning more about how we can support people who are non-speaking to make decisions. I will hand you over to David McDonough, our CEO now, who will introduce our speakers.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Margaret, for introducing our seminar today. I would just like to welcome you all today to this really important seminar that is really dear to our hearts at Inclusion Ireland. And it is about, as Margaret has said, the right of every single person and their right to communicate and the right to have their voice heard. Just briefly, before we get into the presentations and to the panelists, just about Inclusion Ireland. We're a national rights-based organisation focused on people with intellectual disabilities. And our sole purpose is to work towards the full inclusion of people with intellectual disabilities by supporting people to have their voices heard and advocating for rights under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. So just to, I suppose, to frame the conversation for today and to bring it back to the United Nations Convention, under Article 21, we are obliged to ensure that persons with disabilities can exercise the freedom of expression and opinion, including the freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas on an equal basis with others and through all forms of communication of their choice. As we all know, the Decision Support Service is due to open its doors this summer, and we want to make sure at Inclusion Ireland that there is always a presumption of a person's capacity to make decisions, no matter what way that they happen to communicate. So what we're hearing when we're talking to people with intellectual disabilities, to supporters, to families, and what we want to come across today in our seminar is about really valuing the voice of the person. And what you'll hear from us today is about respecting the validity of a person's communication, whether through verbal means, through movement, body language, eye contact, sounds, facial expressions, alternative and augmentative communication aids, or a combination of all of these things. And what you'll hear from us today is about all of our responsibility to leave our biases to one side and to presume that somebody has capacity and that we might actually not know best and that the person themselves knows what's best for their lives. And a wise person who I spoke to today talked about it's about learning the language, learning the language of the person who is communicating and how that person is communicating and honouring that. And at Inclusion Ireland, we're really mindful, and from speaking to people who are allies, supporters, and to people with intellectual disabilities themselves, we're very conscious that it's often people with higher support needs who are left out of the conversation the most. And how can we, a question we're asking ourselves at Inclusion Ireland, how can we change that together within the community? And our work at Inclusion Ireland is really focused on that over the last while, and we know that there's lots more to be done in that space to make sure that people with higher support needs have their voice heard. So you'll see in our communication publicly that we talk about people and their support needs. We say no matter if you have high support needs or low support needs or everything in between, it is about your human rights and accessing your rights as an individual. So today's work, I would just like to thank family and support groups who've supported us in putting today's work together, including Profound Ireland, for sharing questions in advance. As I said, today is about honouring people and their stories. And we have a lot of work to do to ensure that people who are non-speaking have their rights met under the Convention and with the Assisted Decision Making Act. Just to say on a positive note, though, we had about 300 people signed up today, and a lot more people asked for recordings of the session. So if you are a non-speaking person, there is solidarity there for you, and we need to build on that as your allies and your supporters. So our speakers today, thank you, Margaret, for introducing our session today, Margaret Tolley, advocate. Next up, we'll have Angela Locke O'Reilly, who's going to share her perspective as a family member. After that, we are delighted to welcome Eleanor Flynn, Professor in Law and Director of the Centre for Disability Law and Policy, National University of Ireland, Galway. And then we have Amy Fieldhouse, Senior Speech and Language Therapist, and Tara Galini, Senior Speech and Language Therapist, who are going to share their perspectives and insights. So without further ado, I am going to welcome Angela this afternoon. Angela is an advocacy project worker with Inclusion Ireland, and she's also a mother of a gentleman called Jacob, who we're all getting to know at Inclusion Ireland as well. And the way that Angela speaks about Jacob and talks about him is wonderful to hear. So I just wanted to ask Angela onto the call today, because we had a conversation earlier today where I said, what do you wish people knew? What do you wish people knew about your child? And Angela is here to talk about that this afternoon. So welcome, Angela.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today. And as Derval said, I'm an advocacy project worker with Inclusion Ireland, but my first and foremost role in life is I am mother to Jacob, who is 14. He's autistic and he has Down syndrome, and he would be nonverbal. And I actually wrote down what I wanted to say because I didn't want to forget anything. So when a new person comes into Jacob's life and they want to learn about how to communicate with Jacob, I always say leave ego, assumption, expectation, and preconception at the door. The spoken word is not my son's first language, so he uses other things such as tone, inflection, behavior, routine and pattern changes, mood. But just as he uses these things to communicate, so too are you using them to communicate with him, whether it's conscious or unconsciously. Jacob will be reading or listening to you speaking his language, whether you know it or not. Sometimes you might be screaming things at him, sometimes you might be whispering things to him, and sometimes he might not understand what you're trying to say. But it's just important to realize that you are constantly communicating with him, just as he is constantly communicating with you, even when neither of you are saying a word. You also have to give him all the time and physical and personal or emotional space that he needs. He doesn't do eye contact either, so I include that in giving him his physical and personal space. Sometimes you have to accept that Jacob doesn't want to communicate with you at all, and you may have to wait as long as he feels like it before he's going to communicate with you. And that's okay, because sometimes none of us want to speak. And also you should expect the unexpected. That's why I say leave preconceptions and ego at the door. Sometimes he might want to say something totally outside the box that you might think is totally crazy. But sometimes we all say things that make no sense whatsoever. But if we were silenced every time we wanted to say something like that, we'd be pretty upset about it. So never listen to something that he communicates to you and say, oh no, that couldn't be what he's trying to say, because maybe it is. So never make assumptions about what he wants to say. And often he will want to say something that you might not want to hear. And also, finally, use all the resources available to you to communicate with him or decipher what he's trying to say. And that can be a tool or device, but it can be so many other things, like time, give him time, or ask in the experience of people who've been around him a lot, like myself, his dad, his SNA, his friends. So sometimes for Jacob, one of the big things for him is if he changes a pattern of behavior. And I think sometimes that's the first thing that you notice about Jacob. But if you didn't notice it, that would almost be like silencing him as well. So I always say to people to be observant, because sometimes he could be telling you something, and just by not being observant, you're going to miss it. But yeah, so importantly, be adaptable, patient, respectful, and allow him the freedom and control that he has every right to. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Angela, for sharing your insights and your experience. We really appreciate that this afternoon. I'm now going to hand you over to Eleanor Flynn, who's our next panelist who's going to present this afternoon. A very warm Inclusion Ireland welcome to you, Eleanor, and thank you for your time this afternoon.
Thanks very much, Derval, and thanks to everyone who is involved in today's event and attending. It's great to be with you all. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the human rights approach to thinking about this term you might be hearing more of, which is respect for the person's will and preferences. And I know that Amy and Tara are going to talk a lot about this in their presentation as well. So I'll try to talk about where these ideas come from, why they're important, and what I think they mean. And I know that Amy and Tara are going to talk more about the practice of how you do it. So hopefully our presentations will dovetail together really nicely in that way. Okay, so I'm going to start by talking about where our human rights standards come from and how they're informed by lived experience. And that's not just the very important lived experience of non-speaking people and people with other non-conventional forms of communication, but also by those who supported them. So family leadership was a really important component in the development of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And sometimes I think maybe people aren't aware of that history, but it's definitely there. So I'm going to talk about it and where this idea comes from. Then I'm just going to refer to a few of the core articles of the convention that use this concept of respect for will and preference, or that embed it in a particular way, so that explain why communication is a human right for everyone and how we should respect everyone's unique form of communication. And then I'll try to bring it back to Irish law, talking briefly about how the idea of respect for will and preference is recognised in the Assisted Decision-Making Capacity Act, which, of course, as Derval mentioned, is intended to be fully operational later this summer. And then finally, I'll end my presentation by briefly touching on some of Jo Watson's work as a speech and language therapist and as someone who writes and researches with people with complex communication about supporting decision-making and why it's so important to acknowledge, interpret, and act upon the person's will and preference. So to begin, I want to share a story, a real life story that informed a lot of theory about supported decision-making and a lot of the content of our human rights standards that I'm going to be speaking about in a minute. And that's the story of Audrey Cole and her son, Ian. So Ian has quite complex communication. He's non-speaking. He has a lot of different disabilities and complex health issues. And when Ian was growing up, Audrey, as his mom, was advised that he should be placed under guardianship, he should be segregated, he should live in an institutional setting. That would be the best thing for him, and it would be the best thing for their family. And while Audrey later recognized and realized that that wasn't Ian wanted or needed or would be best for him, or indeed for their family, there was a very strong impetus on them as a family to go along with this plan for Ian. And Audrey's fight to get Ian out of an institution and out of adult guardianship and into what we now call supported decision-making is one of the most powerful stories that has influenced so many things, including the development of supported decision-making law in Canada, but also it influenced the development of the human rights standard that we have now in Article 12 of the UN Convention. So I've included a quote from Audrey here in an interview that she did with Michael Bach, who some of you may have heard of. Again, Michael's a very influential person in community living circles in Canada and someone who has been influential in Article 12 implementation around the world. So they were talking about this concept, which sounds like really theoretical and philosophical, of human will, but it's actually quite grounded in experience, as you'll see from this quote. So Audrey says that human will, that instinctive and inherently human imperative, that sense of being, that thing that tells us we are here, that we can feel. I honestly don't think it has anything to do with intellect. Ian has it. It is what makes him stop suddenly and listen to the sounds of birds or of the wind blowing through the trees. I am sure it is what makes him so sensitive to music. It is also what makes him instinctively draw back or resist things he doesn't understand, such as an unfamiliar medical procedure, for example. Certainly the thing that's prompted him on a couple of occasions when Fred, her husband, had been in intensive care, to gently reach out and stroke Fred's arm. Usually would have to be prompted to make such personal contact. I don't know what it is, but I do know we all have it. And if we take the trouble to get to know people who do not communicate in typical ways, we become very conscious of it. So Audrey was very much part of the negotiations in New York that developed the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And there was a strong focus in the negotiations on hearing directly from disabled people about their rights and what was important to them. And families were very central in this process where they could support other people's perspective on what was important to them. So one story from the negotiation involved, again, a non-speaking person who was there with a family member participating in the negotiations. And a disabled people's organization asked him to join them for lunch. And again, a lot of the big developments of the convention text actually happened outside the main negotiation area, in the cafe, in the breaks of the main sessions. So this was really important invitation. But they said to his family member, not you, we just want to meet with this man. And the family member said, okay, sure, you can go to lunch, with this person, but you're not going to understand their communication, but you can try, go for it. And they came back and got the family member a few minutes later because they realized they couldn't understand this person's communication without a lot of support. So I think we all need to be humble and acknowledge when we're not understanding other people's communication. And while we're centering the person, we have to remember that where people around them understand their communication, we've got to involve them. We've got to ensure that they can help us to communicate with the person directly. So this, again, is an image taken from a photograph Mats Jespersen, a Swedish activist, took during the negotiations of the convention. And it shows a lot of the key players who were very influential on the development of the right to legal capacity in Article 12, people like Amita Danda, Tina Minkowitz, Robert Martin. But it shows you the kind of packed and slightly chaotic nature of the negotiation process itself. A lot has been written and said about this process, so I don't want to take too much time here, but I will say that it is unique in UN human rights treaty drafting processes, and everyone comments on how the high levels of engagement that this treaty had compared to all of the other human rights conventions that came before, and particularly the inclusive drafting process, where disabled people were really leading the drafting process, not just with their own organizations, but also representing their states. And that became really important. But the focus of the convention is that disabled people, including non-speaking people, are rights holders. They are the rights holders under this convention. And the role of families is then very important and central to uphold and to support the exercise of these individuals' rights. But families aren't themselves rights holders under this particular UN convention. And I think it's important that people know that that's different. So who is responsible, who is accountable under this convention? It's the states that sign up to it, that ratify the convention. They are the duty bearers. So they are obliged to meet the standards of the convention that they have committed themselves to. And where they fail to meet those standards, including the standards about supporting everyone's communication and respecting everyone's decision-making process, then they are open to accountability being held up to the microscope in different ways. And that can happen where people take individual complaints to the UN committee that monitors the convention. And also it happens through periodic reporting. So all the states that ratify the convention have to show up every 4 years in Geneva and explain themselves to the UN committee, which is primarily made up of disabled people themselves, and now includes, and has done for the last number of years, a representative for the first time of a man with intellectual disability, Robert Martin from New Zealand, who was again very, very centrally involved in the development of the text of the convention in the first place. So that's where these standards come from. They don't come from the sky. They don't come from, out of touch human rights experts. They come from people who have lived and walked this journey, including the people themselves and the family members and others in their lives who love them and know them and have supported them along the way. So with that said, what does Article 12 actually say about respecting people's communication? Well, the important thing, the first thing that it says is that persons with disabilities enjoy legal capacity on an equal basis with others in all aspects of life. And this is really important because sometimes we might think that, oh, it's only the significant decisions in people's lives, the ones that relate to money or where to live or whether to get married. Those are the, real legally binding decisions that, okay, people should be allowed to make, decisions in important areas. But it says in all aspects of life, and it means it. So that means everything from, decisions that might seem small or insignificant to other people. But if they are decisions that have potentially legal consequences, they are still decisions that we deserve equality for everyone on. It also, very importantly, and for the first time in a human rights instrument globally, says that states are responsible for providing access for persons with disabilities to the support they may require in exercising their legal capacity. So everyone has legal capacity according to this convention. Every single person, no matter how significant their disability is, no matter how complex their communication, they have that right to make decisions that the law must respect and treat equally. And that means that not only have they a right to make a decision, but they have the right to the support they might need to make that decision, to express, to communicate, to share their perspective. And that perspective will then be used to ground the decision. And then in the third paragraph of Article 12, we see this explicit reference to will and preference. So it says that safeguards relating to the exercise of legal capacity respect the rights, will, and preference of the person. This is really important because when we talk about safeguards in other contexts, we're often talking about restricting people. And this is not about restricting, this is about respecting. So this is saying the best way to keep people safe is to respect their wishes, is to honor what they are telling us is important in their lives. That is what we need to be doing. And all of the other things that are restrictive that we have been doing to people that we have said or justified, that we think would have kept them safe, like what happened to Ian Cole he was told, his family were told he would be safer in an institution, he would be more protected. He was not. He was abused in that context. And also, even if he hadn't been abused, he was restricted. He was not allowed to make decisions. He was not allowed to choose where and with whom to live on an equal basis with others. And that's just not good enough anymore. The human rights standards are telling us we have to respect each individual human being's will and preferences. The person knows what they want and need for their own life. And it's our job to listen to that and to honor it as much as we can with anyone, because I think I need to be clear here. When I'm talking about respecting someone's wishes and honoring them, I'm not saying that this is the same as wish fulfillment, that any whim that enters our mind is something that has to be, everyone has to drop everything and make sure that that whim is given life. That's not how it works for any person. And so disabled people are not asking for special treatment in this respect, but just for equal respect. That if I'm telling someone this is important to me, this is significant for my life, I want to do it this way, that will be listened to and respected in the same way that it would be for a non-disabled person. And that's really, really important. So I've been talking about this thing called will and preference, but I haven't yet really explained what I mean by it. And I would kind of separate it out into two distinct concepts. One is the will, and I did share with you what Audrey Cole thinks human will is about, that spark, that thing that motivates all of us. And that is a little bit different, for me at least, from what the person's preferences might be. So I usually like to describe the person's will as their vision for the good life for themselves, for all of us. What are our long-term goals and desires? What do we really want to get out of life? And sometimes that might come into conflict with our more immediate preferences. So we often contradict ourselves and we change our minds about what's important to us. It might not be the same thing through time. There are some things that are so significant and important in our lives that they're probably going to be there for a long time. There are concepts that are stable through time. But there are lots of other things that we change our mind about, and life experience and, being open to new things and new people and getting to try things out can really change what both our will and our preferences might be on a given issue. So if the will is the long term, the big picture, the goal, then the preference for me is the more immediate, the likes and dislikes, which absolutely everyone has. And again, even for people who communicate quite differently, those around them are often very well able to identify how they communicate what they like and what they don't like, when they're happy and comfortable and when they're uncomfortable and unhappy. Those signs are very well known to people around them. So that's the person's preferences. But I would also say within preferences, we include how we prioritize things. So if I have to choose between two things, how am I going to make that choice? What's more important to me? So in my life, for example, where I live, living in cities has always been something that's been really important to me. And so there are other things I might be willing to give up in order to make that vision happen or to have that preference respected. So I think it's understanding the person really well and knowing what things they might be, if they had to choose between two things, what's more important or what would influence that decision for that person is something that we can understand as being part of the person's preferences. So in interpreting the UN Convention, the UN committee that is responsible, that I mentioned, that sits in Geneva, made up primarily of disabled people and that meets with governments around the world to interrogate them on what they have been doing. That committee developed a document called General Comment 1, which explains to states in more detail how to realise Article 12. And they talk here about how we should interpret will and preferences and what we should do in situations where we have tried our best, we've tried all the techniques that we know, and we're still not sure what it is the person is trying to tell us. How can we move forward and respect the person in that situation in decision making? So they introduce this idea of the best interpretation of will and preference, so that they say this is what must replace our old approach where we would have done a best interest decision making, and we would have decided what we thought was best for the person and followed that instead of really looking at what the person wanted. And the best interpretation means that we've done our homework, we've written everything down, we've documented all of our process of how we've tried to communicate with this person, what we've learned from that, from speaking to people who know this person well. What is it that they're telling us about how the person makes decisions, how they communicate and what's important to them and how they decided other issues like this in the past. And we're putting together all that evidence and we're doing our best, the best we possibly can to come up with what we think is the person's will and preferences, but we're just not 100% sure. As long as we've done all that homework and tried our absolute best, we can go ahead and we can use that to ground the decision about the person's life. That's that's completely compatible with what human rights law is telling us. We're not overtaking the person, we're not doing best interests, we're really thinking about what the person wants and trying to ground the decision in that. And we just have to live with the uncertainty that we'll never be 100% sure if we're right. For people with complex communication, that's perhaps more true, but for others as well, even for people with typical forms of communication who say conflicting things all the time, we can never be 100% sure, is this really the person's will and preferences? But we're doing our best to prove that it is, and that's what's really important. Okay, so I'm conscious of time, but I do want to just briefly mention Article 19, because it's about living in the community. And I think for many people, it's those choices that people get to make about where and with whom to live that are the best examples of will and preference that we can find. They're also a great example of how you can really support someone to explore options and make a decision. And again, acknowledging that Ireland has definitely not done enough on any of these articles. We are not there yet. We're not world leading in this respect for sure, but these are opportunities to try out supported decision making and to see how we can understand the person's communication and build the decisions that are being made around their will and preference. And I just want to mention again, Derval touched on this as well at the beginning, Article 21, which is on freedom of expression, which again, in traditional human rights instruments was about, you know, freedom of the press and freedom of speech. But really interestingly, in this convention, because it's about disability, it focuses on the right to communicate in any format that the person chooses and how all of that is valid communication. So it's great to see that officially recognized in a human rights instrument. So how does all of this play out in our law in Ireland, the law that's about to be fully commenced, the Assisted Decision-Making Capacity Act? The important, I suppose, things to remember about the Act is that there are a number of different options under the Act that people, including non-speaking people, might choose to take up to provide evidence of how they make decisions or to make sure that other people interacting with them involve the supporters that they want involved in the decision-making process. So I would really see the Act as an opportunity for people and families, people around them who love and care about them, their friends, their peers, to plan ahead, to make arrangements, to put things on paper so that if people start to be questioned in the future about why are you involved in this decision, this person's an adult, we shouldn't be speaking with their family about this, that you have this documentation ready to go so that you can evidence that this person uses me for support to communicate or wants my assistance in decision making, and we're recognizing and honoring that relationship, and we have a way to legally recognize that now under the Capacity Act. So I've just tried to color code the options under the Act in this traffic light system, green being the options that I think are the most flexible and empowering, red being the ones that are less so, but and amber being sort of intermediate ones that still allow the person some level of control, but the person's also giving up quite a bit of control to other decision makers in their lives. I won't go into them in detail now, but I'm happy to take questions on them later as well if it would be helpful. The most important thing I want to draw your attention to from the Act is this part of the guiding principles where we see respect for will and preference being explicitly mentioned. And this is really important. And for me, as one of the people who campaigned on this law and continues to campaign on it, this is the biggest win that we got in the whole process, was this law does not say best interests anywhere. It only says the person's will and preferences. So under the guiding principles, which is the part of the law that we have to look at to interpret all the other sections. So everything that's done under this Act has to be compliant with the guiding principles. And it says interveners, which interveners is a very broad term in the law, applying to families, to healthcare professionals, to financial professionals, legal professionals, anyone who's acting under this law must give effect insofar as is practicable to the past and present will and preferences of the relevant person, insofar as they're reasonably ascertainable. And that reasonably ascertainable part, again, refers to how we figure out the person's will and preference, because that can be hard work. And we're going to hear more from Amy and Tara about how we're going to do that in practice. So just to end, before Amy and Tara start to give you more practical advice, I want to end with a quote from Jo Watson, who is really one of the most important scholars, I would say, in this area, one of the most important researchers and practitioners writing and working in the area of supporting the decision-making of people with complex communication. And she uses this framework of requiring us to acknowledge the person's communication and will and preference first. We've got to acknowledge they have a will and preference. What is it? Are we listening? Interpreting it, figuring it out, teasing out the bits that might seem contradictory or conflicting. And once we've gone through that process, we act upon the decision that the person is asking to be made. But Jo recognizes the importance of supporters in this process. And she says that supporters contribute to the process by responding to these expressions of will and preference through acknowledging as opposed to ignoring, interpreting and acting on this expression. And effective supporter responsiveness in her research was found to be most likely when supporters had a really positive view of the person's decision-making capacity. So I'll end there and hand over to the next speakers who are going to take you through more practical examples of how you can do this and really ground it in their experience as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eleanor, for that wonderful presentation. And I suppose what really came home to me is about that real recognition and honoring the relationship that we all have when we're making decision making with when we're making decisions with one another, and that we all need support. We all make good and bad decisions. We all change our mind, or we half make decisions, or we come back to something time and time again. And it's all relational and how we support each other in that. So, and that's no different for somebody who happens to have higher support needs or who is non-speaking. And I was particularly struck as well, and I'm glad that that was emphasized towards the end around the guiding principles, that, you know, it's really clear that we must give effect in as far as possible to the past and present will and preference of the person. So thank you so much for clearly outlining that. And as Eleanor has said, she's happy to take questions in the chat function, and we can come back to any of those as we go through the afternoon. So just to move on to our next presenters, and a very warm welcome to Amy Fieldhouse and Tara Galini, both are senior speech and language therapists. And Amy is going to start the presentation this afternoon. And as Eleanor has said, we're going to get into that, like the nuts and bolts of this, and how we build relationship with the person who is non-speaking and how we honor that person's communication. So Amy, I'll hand over to you first.
Thank you very much, Devo. Lovely to be here today. We were asked today to give a talk on how people who are non-speaking and who may have higher support needs communicate, and how we can support them in making decisions. So I think some people may say that the person I support has very basic communication and cannot contribute to making complex decisions. So what we are hoping to try and explain today is that everyone has the ability to communicate. And in many instances, we already have that information, but it's about working your way through all that information to really listen to a person's will and preference, and then to identify that and how we can shape it into making a decision. Our focus today is really on supporting people who are non-speaking and have higher support needs, who may not have a formal system of communication or use a consistent symbolic form of communication. So kind of moving on, I'm briefly, for the purpose of keeping this very short and practical, I'm going to skim over the Assisted Decision-Making Capacity Act. What I will take from this, so when looking at supporting and promoting decision-making for people with higher support needs, I keep these 9 guiding principles from the Assisted Decision-Making Act in the back of my mind, and it guides the process of which I can support somebody to make those decisions. So these guiding principles are a lot of them are related to the more human rights-based approaches to decision-making as well, which I'll go on to explain a little bit further. So I've underlined the ones which are of particular relevance today, but the first one is presuming capacity. So everyone is able to make a decision and be autonomous. More on that on the next slide. And it's a basic human right. the first one that we're going to look at, and Tara's going to discuss more, is how we support relevant people to make those decisions. We're going to look at some strategies that may assist in supporting understanding for people with higher support needs. And to do this, we need to really, really understand how they understand information and how they perceive and interact with the world that they live in and what their lived experiences are. Sorry, we've got to skip ahead there. We just go back to the will and preference as well. So giving effect to will and preference, as Eleanor kind of had discussed, it is pretty much key. So a lot of what we're going to talk to today is how we encourage and facilitate participation, how we look at documenting past and present beliefs, values, wills and preferences. And it's really important for me, one of the key principles for guiding decision-making for somebody with higher support needs. So those are kind of the main pieces that we're going to look at today. So moving on to autonomy as a human right. So Eleanor talked in detail about Article 12 of the Convention of the Rights for Persons with Disabilities. What I'm taking from that is that everybody has the right to self-determination and autonomy. So all of us, regardless of our intellectual disability or anything else, has this right to autonomy. But what is autonomy? So the Assisted Decision-Making Act states that autonomy is the right to make decisions according to our personal values, beliefs, and wills and preferences. And if we look at kind of a dictionary definition, it's described as the right or condition of self-government, the freedom from external controls or influence, and the ability to act on his or her own values and interests. I kind of want you to have a think about how you are autonomous. So how do you make decisions? How many decisions have you made so far today? Surely I had to decide to get out of bed. That might have not been in line with my will and preference, but it had to be done. I had to decide what clothes I was going to wear. I had to decide if I had time for breakfast, how much coffee I'm going to drink. So I've had to make lots and lots of decisions today, which are very small and quite concrete and easy to make. But then how do you actually make a big decision? If you had to make a decision about medical procedures that you had to have, or your retirement, or moving house, how would you make those decisions? Do you act alone, or do you act with a support group? Do you ask your friends, your family for their opinions and inputs? Do you ask professionals who might have a professional opinion on this? Do you get lots of ideas and then make a decision on that? And can you change your mind? So there is a perception that there's a group of people who cannot be supported to make a decision, and kind of a perception that it's those who can't communicate formally or in a sophisticated way symbolically who are not able to make these decisions. However, if we move on to communication and decision making, everybody communicates. We just need to listen. So we need to listen very carefully. We need to look at how we support somebody's understanding of the decisions that they have to make, and as well as their expressive communication. We need to understand as much as possible about that person's lived experience and how they relate to the world around them. We need to really understand past and present experiences and the person's reactions to those, because they can tell a lot about will and preference. We all do this already, okay? Or hopefully we all do this already, but it's kind of pulling it together. So how do we pull together somebody's will and preference and shape and support a person's decision-making? So I just have a quote here. So the more we make successful decisions and assert our autonomy, the more likely we are to make other decisions and develop our decision-making skills. So we need to look at how we can hear and document the voices of everyone and how we can make people make more decisions. So Tara is going to talk a little bit more about will and preference, and then go into detail a little bit more about communication.
Hi, I'm just going to make sure you can see the slides okay there. Are they all right?
They're perfect. Yeah, Tara,
Okay.
thank you.
Great. So just one second, just get my notes up here. Sorry. There's just a lot of boxes here. So can you see my slides still, or are they gone?
They may have gone. I can see your power. Oh, they're back.
Okay. Okay. So thank you very much for your patience there. So thank you, Amy and Eleanor. And as you've explained, the guiding principles of assisted decision making are there to support a person who has higher support needs to make informed decisions. And I'll be focusing on will and preference as the building block to decision making for anyone, regardless of their support needs, but particularly for someone who is non-speaking. So what is will and preference? To break up will and preference into 3 points, it means we need to take account of the person's beliefs and values that might influence any decision a person might make. We need to think about the person's past and present wishes, whether this is expressed verbally or through any other means, such as body language, habits, sign, or any communicative method. And we need to recognize the authority of every person as an expert in their own life. So everybody's life is unique and everybody experiences life in their own way. If you have a disability, you have the lived experience of having a disability, and therefore you are the expert in your own life, and your opinion is the one that matters. So if you support someone with higher support needs, you will be asking, well, how can we best support their someone to make a decision? And you might think, where do I begin? Well, everyone communicates. And however they do it needs to be honored, and you may not realize that you've already taken the first steps. Let's break down honoring communication into 5 parts. If you're supporting a person who is non-speaking, then that person needs how they communicate or their expressive communication acknowledged, because that communication needs to be interpreted. That person needs the way they understand acknowledged. And then we need trusted people to make sure their voice is heard. So relationships are important. We need to act on what the person is telling us. If we follow these steps, we're more likely to respect and honor a person's communication, and therefore that person is more likely to make a successful decision. So if you are supporting a non-speaking person, you will probably have connected and built up a relationship with him or her already. That connection means you have acknowledged their communication. That connection means that you are connecting and building a relationship with a person with higher support needs. And this means you are reaching out with your heart, your mind, and your body and finding the joy in being with the person. That is called the joyful connection. And this means developing an authentic relationship. I'd like to tell you a little bit about my experience in finding joy in connecting with someone. Mark is a person who has higher support needs and is non-speaking. With Mark, I had to build a relationship with him over a long period of time before I could really connect with him and could really learn his language. When I connected with Mark, I had to use his language, not mine, to let him know, I see you, I noticed you. I noticed Mark's actions and rhythms before I copied them, matching his speed and rhythm and letting myself be led into his world so that I could see the world through his eyes. To get to this point, I had to be tuned in to his interests and responsive to that. I listened to his humming and knew he was happy. I heard the humming get louder and I knew he was growing tired and he'd had enough. Letting Mark lead the interactions was hard to do because I had to empty myself of my own ideas and beliefs and let him tell me what interested him. I knew he loved chocolate and it would be a great way to share an experience together because I love chocolate too. But actually, Mark wasn't interested in chocolate when I was there because my visits meant having fun, not eating. So with Mark, I needed to do a little bit more of being quiet and let the interactions evolve. We can underestimate the impact of the senses on communication and the role they have to play in interactions. We can think about the activities a person might enjoy and really think about what it is about that experience they like. This is thinking about the sensory part of the experience. On another day with Mark, we were in the gym, and when I sat back and I mirrored Mark and I closed my eyes, I realized that what was important to Mark was actually the sound of a ball bouncing. Well, for a long time, I had thought it was the visual of the ball. I realized that the sound or rhythm was another way to connect with Mark, and that's a memory and a realization that I will never forget. As Angela mentioned earlier, giving a person time to process and to respond is essential to the whole communication experience. This is relevant because once we've made a connection, we are in a better position to understand a person's communication and understand what the person is telling us. Then we can see actually this person has a lot to say, and we have insight into the person and what's important to the person. So what does non-speaking communication look like? It can be vocalizations. These can be high or low, or a certain tune that is hummed. It can be behaviors such as turning on the lights on and off. It can be as simple as a person's breathing pattern. For one man I know, he flicks his eyes upwards to mean I like this experience, but if he's not in a great mood, then it could be any number of different eye movements. I know someone else that expresses that he wants something by standing next to me. So you could also look for a head movement to the left, or a continuous head movement, repetitive movements, body movements, eye gaze. These all have the potential to mean something, and the potential to mean something for specific situations or even environments. It's good to remember that a person's communication style can differ depending on a person's relationship with someone else. If you think about yourself, there might be people in your life that you immediately change your style of communication or manners with when you're speaking with them. I know that when I speak to my boss, I speak to my boss differently than I might speak to my work colleagues. You can see that communication is not limited to using words. Collecting this information takes time and can be challenging, but between all the people that know and love the person with high support needs, you'll be able to gather a multitude of information. So I've adapted a quote here from Jim Sinclair, who spoke this quote in Canada at a conference in 1993, and I think it echoes the speaker's thoughts here today. You're going to have to give up the certainty that comes of being on your own territory, of knowing you're in charge, and let the person teach you a little of her language, guide you a little way into his world. We all enter relationships with our own ideas and assumptions, but actually, as Jim Sinclair says here, it really is about letting go of your certainties and letting the person lead and teaching you his or her language. So how can you help me understand the decision I have to make? We've looked at expression, and expressing yourself is how you send a message. And now we come to understanding the message, or in this case, today's case, the decision that has to be made. Understanding information is the information that I receive. So to help me understand, I might have to process the information over time and over a period of experience. And we know that everyone has responses to things they experience, don't they? We can also use people's strengths, which may be through their sensory skills, to guide them and to help them to attach meaning. So here is a brief list of some of the ways that we can understand information. And of course, this list is not exhaustive. If you know the person really well, you will know which way or any of the ways he or she understands information. You can see here objects of reference. And objects help a person to understand what is happening now. It could be a bar of soap, and that could mean that it's time to wash hands. You can use sensory indicators, so things like colors, sound, smells. If you think about the jangle of keys, that sound can mean we're leaving. A sign made on your body, on body signing, is used particularly for people with visual impairment. A type of touch can say, I'm here. Also important to remember is that context gives us information too. Mark, who I mentioned earlier, doesn't understand football if he's on the bus, but he certainly understands football if we're in the gym, because that's where he plays football. One of Mark's strengths actually is making sense of his world through smell. And you can see the smells reassure him and let him know what's happening. For going to respite, he uses the smell from an empty laundry bottle, because that's the laundry that they use specifically in respite, and he knows that's where he's going. And then there's perfume on a handkerchief that lets him know that he's going home. That this experience has happened many times before and has built up his understanding. So we can see here, interpreting will and preference is an important role for anyone supporting a person who has difficulty communication or understanding. So this may happen over time or may be immediately clear. However it happens, it is important to try and get the interpretation right. So how can we help others understand what I'm saying? If we have the enormous responsibility of interpreting a person's will and preference, then it's important to try and get it right. And it's important to let other people know what the person is saying. If I refer to my friend Mark again, I can tell you that we sat down together and documented how he understands and sends messages. Once it was documented, that information could be shared with current staff members and relevant people in his life, such as the doctor, and hopefully with future staff members. So now other people, other than his direct family members and his key workers, can understand the messages. And we've extended his circle of support to more than 10 people who can recognize the choices he is making. And that has a really positive impact on Mark, because the more choices he makes, the more we get to know Mark and his preferences. The more you see me as an individual who can make decisions, the more you will try and interpret my communication and allow me to make decisions that reflect my will and preference. If we really listen, there are many things that the person we are supporting can tell us and make decisions on. Building up preferences into choices over time, connecting these to form a person's will, or working from the person's will and values to develop concrete preferences. So how can we check, that our translations are correct or accurate? How can we check that we got the information right? Well, it's important to accurately record a person's communication and what it means over time. A record of how a person reacts to an experience will help build a picture of her likes and dislikes. We can build up preferences into choices, connecting these to form a person's will, or working from their will and values to develop concrete preferences. So we've mentioned a couple of times now about documentation, and for people who are in organizations or services, there will likely be a record of a person's communication style, their preferences, and how to communicate with them. Here are a few examples of what they might look like. So documentation can be communication passports, communication dictionaries, all about me documents, hospital passports, or speech and language therapy reports. Collaboration with all parties who know and love the person will help to keep a record of all a person's experiences and reactions to these experiences. So let's think about, if you are the key person and you have access to all this important knowledge about a non-speaking person, then we have the responsibility to share that knowledge so that it doesn't get lost. This means ideally we have records at home as well as in the formal paper files. So at home, we could have maybe photo albums of a person's experiences through the years, experiences of the family days, the school days, the holidays. Don't forget, also, we rarely take photographs of the days when we're upset and the bad days. So it's important to keep a record somewhere of these, and they can be referred to about maybe the way the relevant person reacted or communicated his sadness at this time. You can also use talking photo albums to record vocalizations. This could help us recognize the differences in tone and what they mean. Other ways you can record is through videos of experiences, or show how a person enjoys something or how they look when they're sick. There are apps that can support this if you like technology, and if you don't like technology, a keepsake box or a scrapbook are perfectly acceptable as well, and they're great for collecting information, recording a person's life story, and that will help support information gathering for will and preference now and in the future. So myself and Amy really wanted to make an emphasis on the importance of relationships. We all need relationships, but people with higher support needs need them even more in order to be heard. Development of positive, trusting relationships, particularly in the context of decision-making, cannot be underestimated. Supportive relationships or circles of support are often very small, and we do need to expand these, as I said. But what we don't want is for a person's preferences to go unheard. So we need significant support from people in their lives who know and love them. So acting on what a person is telling us should be a collaborative process. Having a full and rich understanding of what the person with higher support needs is telling us requires talking to more than one person. Think about when you made a decision. You might ask lots of people for support in making a decision. I know recently when I went to the garage to buy a new car that I brought my father with me to help me make a decision. But then when I got home, I needed to talk through my decision with my old school friend who has known me and my family for years. That's just a little example of why good, close relationships with other people are needed to make decisions. I'll finish here on Joe Watson's work, Joe Watson's framework, which summarizes the process more simply. Joe Watson's work provides a tool for supporting people who are non-speaking to live lives that they prefer. If we use this process, then the decision can be transparent because there's an emphasis on documenting all the steps along the way. And remember what I said about the collaborative process. You can see the process here mentions the word together. And all the steps. And this is important because there should be lots of evidence about preferences from many different environments in the past and the present. We listen together to what the person is saying. Remember, we use their preferences as building blocks to making decisions. We explore the options and build evidence together, and that will be found in, remember, the life stories, the videos, the All About Me books. We know that the person might need to experience the decision options and that the responses have to be recorded and built up over time. Or the answer might be immediate and definitive, but as long as we have a record of this, then it can all be gathered as evidence. Finally, we have all the information we need and we're pretty sure what the person is saying. So we've consulted with everyone who knows and loves the person, so we act on it and make sure the person's decision is respected. And don't forget that if the person changes their mind, that's okay, you have listened. So we can start the process again and support him to make another decision. And I'm going to let Amy take over here.
Helps if I unmute. Okay, hi again. So what I'm going to do is kind of recap over what Tara has said and then make it very practical. So showing some examples. So I've got two examples of my own, and then I've got an example that was sent in prior to this presentation as well. So I'm going to use that as an example. So when supporting a person to communicate their will and preference, it's really important to develop my social and relationship network. Making decisions is generally a collective process, and the onus is just not on one person making that decision. So no matter where we are on the decision-making framework, or within the decision-making service, I do really feel that this process should be honoured because those people closest to the person making the decision really can support and uphold somebody's will and preference. It's really useful for my support team to think differently about me. Joe Watson talks about asking the big questions. So if this person did not have higher support needs, what would they be doing in their life? Where would they be living? What kind of job would they have? And your answers to that will help inform your kind of answers to all the other decisions that they make, because they can reflect a person's will and preference and values and beliefs. Again, documentation, I know it's not everybody's favorite word, but it's really important to document things. It's really important to document past and present. Life story work is really useful and can really help inform future decisions and really help determine will and preference. You kind of have to think that if you aren't with me now, how are others going to know my will and preference? Videos, communication dictionaries, and communication passports are kind of what Tara has talked about. I also use monitoring sheets in my own practice to look at the impact a decision is having on somebody and a person's reaction to it. I'll come to that a little bit more at the end. Okay. We need to acknowledge that people with higher support needs may need to experience something before I make up my mind. In fact, I might need an awful lot of experience of something to really know what my decision is going to be. Documenting responses can help determine will and preference. And again, if we're looking at supporting somebody's understanding, so we can use objects of reference, we can use smells, multisensory approaches. But for a lot of people with higher support needs, this understanding develops over time. Okay. Sorry, going to the next one there. A free quote here is: the more people who can hear and act on my decisions, the more autonomy I will have. So the wider somebody's social relationship circle is, the wider their circle of support, you have more people in your life who know you and can act and help shape decisions according to your will and preference. So before we go on to the examples, I kind of want to talk a little bit about the types of decisions that people can make. And again, thinking about the decisions you've made today, or even this week, we've all made little decisions. So we've all made decisions about what I'm going to wear today. Am I going to have a cup of tea or a cup of coffee? And in fairness, that's a decision that can be quite easily supported for somebody with higher support needs. I know that John doesn't like to wear long sleeves and long trousers, and he likes the labels cut out of all of his tops because that's a reflection of his sensory preferences. So we can help make those choices according to their will and preferences there. Bigger decisions are harder, but they can be broken down into small steps. So we don't have to make, am I going to change jobs as a whole one? I need to maybe break that down into lots of different questions. Personal decisions, decisions that affect other people, choice decisions. Complex decisions, so those with kind of open-ended questions, are probably some of the hardest questions. What happens if I'm really unwell? Because there's so many different outcomes. But if we can document somebody's will and preference as a whole, we can allow that will and preference to influence the decisions when they had to be made. I also really do want to acknowledge that sometimes decision-making can be a really, really long process, and we don't often have the luxury of time in making these decisions. So that's, for me, where the importance of having the documentation there that looks at somebody's life story, that looks at somebody's communication, how you support understanding, and a kind of loose outline of somebody's will and preference is really, really good to have in case those decisions have to be made quickly. So these are my examples, okay? So I've put two examples. I have Jerry and Luke, okay? So I'm going to look at how I will apply in practice, kind of apply the decision-making framework that kind of upholds the assisted decision-making acts, guiding principles, and then relate them to a couple of situations. So we'll take Jerry. Just to warn you, there's going to be lots of talking here, so I apologize. So Jerry has been seen by a speech therapist and advised to have thickener in his drinks for the first time to help reduce the risk of aspiration. Jerry is non-speaking and has higher support needs. So I need to think. I need to know how I can support Jerry's understanding so he can make the decision. And I need to know how he communicates so I can listen to and honor his will and preference. So how can I help his understanding? I know that Jerry needs time to process information and build connections. He responds well to the use of objects of reference, but he does need experience of things over time to really help his understanding. So what am I looking for in his communication? Jerry is non-speaking, but he's actually a very functional communicator. He can use body language, posture, gesture, facial expressions, and vocalizations very clearly to indicate likes and dislikes. So I have to go back. So I'm going back to Joe Watson's framework. So what is the question? that Jerry needs to decide. So what is the question we've identified for him? Do I want to have thickener in my drinks to help reduce the risk of aspiration? Okay, so that's the question. So what are the options available to him? Yes, I will have thickener. No, I won't have thickener. Or I really actually don't know. So those are his decisions and the options available. Do we already have information about Jerry's will and preference already? So in the past, we already know that he really, really enjoys his cups of tea and he really, really enjoys his food. And this is actually one of the few pleasures in his life. So changes made to his food and drink are likely to have an impact. Now, Jerry took the thickened fluids when I trialed them with no difficulty, but I know that he needs experience over time to help his understanding. So actually him taking a drink with thickener in on a one-off is not an accurate reflection of his will and preference. So what's my plan? Okay, I'm going to trial thickened fluids with him. I'm going to put in monitoring sheets to record and document the impact and response to that. I want to know what the impact is on Jerry, and I want to know what his responses are. So what is his non-verbal communication and how are we interpreting that? Okay, so that was what my plan was. The outcome, I would love to say that it was plain sailing and Jerry took the thickener, no problem at all. But that's not what happened, okay? Jerry decided and very, very clearly communicated that he did not like thickener in his drink. He pushed the drink away. He started refusing fluids, which all put him at risk of things like dehydration. He even took to hiding the tin of powder, which was, I think, a very, very clear communication that he did not want to have thickener in his drink. Okay, so now I have that information. So we need to act. And we need to help form his will and preference into a decision. Is it an unwise decision? Well, at the moment, that's highly debatable, okay? There's an ongoing kind of information and new evidence around thickener and thickening drinks and the risk of aspiration. So I feel that we can uphold his will and preference and look at reducing the risk of aspiration through other contributing factors. And the impact of having thickener actually resulted in far greater distress and potential harm than actually having the thickener would. Not having thickener would. So the decision made, no thickener. And we will look at supporting him in reducing any risk posed by having dysphagia by managing the other factors. Well, with his consent, that is. Okay. So linking back to the assisted decision making, whose responsibility is it to go through all that? So I was the one who triggered the question, and I was the one who triggered kind of Jerry having to make a decision. So I'm going to be the one who goes through this process with him, and I'm going to listen to Jerry, and I'm going to consult with his circle of support and his main social relationships to check on past and present communication. A little note on that is that I normally put review periods into things like this so that the decision just isn't there. What I might do is put a time frame on that where we might review that decision, or I might just put a number of factors that we need to be aware of. And when those factors come up, then we review that decision as well. So that's Jerry. If we look at Luke, so residential accommodation has been suggested for Luke, but he has never lived away from home and away from his family. So this one is definitely a process. I'm just about aware of time. I'm only going to be a few more minutes, okay? So, and it's actually, this scenario prompts a number of questions. And for me, when we're looking at making decisions, we need to start with a question. What are we asking of that person? And what does that person have to make a decision on? A scenario like this has so many different questions and outcomes. We need to kind of pin it down. So for me, a good starting point is, where does Luke want to live? Okay, so that for me would be my starting point of exploring, where does he want to live? Okay, so I'm going to look at how Luke communicates. Luke uses vocalizations, especially tone and volume. He uses hand and body movements. He uses postural changes and tension, head movements and eye movements to communicate. How can I support his understanding? Luke experiences things from a multisensory perspective. We've done a lot of on-body signing. We've done smell in different rooms to orientate him. We use some objects of reference, but a lot of his understanding is experiential. So do we have any information on his will and preference at the moment? So past experiences. He has actually visited respite, but had a really negative response to this because it was so busy and noisy. We know that Luke prefers quiet and less busy environments. We know that Luke likes to be outside and he likes to go on walks. He likes to have access to sensory rooms. He loves showers, not so much baths. He responds best to the people he has built relationships with over time. His family are so important to him, and he's especially close to his mum. But what about also having kind of predictability and routine is highly important to him. So what's going on at the moment to prompt this kind of scenario? Do we know if he's happy where he's living at the moment? Has anything changed personally for him or within his environment that has affected his feelings about living at home? So what might this documentation look for Luke? So I would be looking at documenting his life story and his preferences and how he's communicated this. We need to listen to what Luke has told us about what is important to him in the past, about his home and the social relationships that he has. What has Luke's response to change been? You know, how did he communicate that? And do we have any examples? Do we have any photos or videos of how he's responded to change in the past? Going through this process, we know that Luke loves being at home. He really establishes relationships slowly. Family are really important to him. He dislikes change and can take time to adjust to any changes. Routine and predictability need to be present. At home, at the moment, there's quite a lot of change and unpredictability, and that's outside of anybody's control at the moment, and is likely to go on for a good bit longer. We know his sensory and movement preferences. We know he likes a quiet environment with access to green spaces and nature. So have we answered the question? Luke appears to be happy at home, but he hasn't had the experience of living away. So how can he make an informed decision without experiencing that? I would have proposed that maybe he tries respite placements, which are more consistently, where his sensory environmental preferences are upheld, and where possible, start forming new social relationships. Go back to kind of Tara's connecting and building relationships over time with the staff there. This needs to be monitored, and we need to document the impact for Luke and Luke's response to this new environment. This information then can be added to the conversation and help shape the decision to be made. So what's the outcome? It's ongoing. There is no real decision that's been made because it's a process, and we still haven't got enough information in order to form a decision. What I would say is that, going back to those guiding principles, they do note that we need to consider the urgency of the intervention. This scenario kind of is very long and drawn out, and it adds lots of information. We might not have that privilege of time. And again, it's going back to having that documentation of his will and preferences, of his values and beliefs, of how he communicates and how we support communication, so that if a decision had to be made quickly and urgently, that his beliefs, his communication, his will and preference can be upheld in any decision made. We did get a question beforehand, and I'm going to summarize it just to keep it anonymous. So it was from somebody who works to support a lady with Down syndrome and who has significant kind of support needs. She does have some multidisciplinary team around her, but what they were looking for is they want her to find a way to express her feelings and wishes about what she would like to do activity-wise. So for me, I think it's really good that, we're looking at involving a wider team, because I do think that making decisions involves a wider group of people. So it might be people who work and support her, it might be family members, it might be friends. So including more people in that conversation. I would then be looking at, well, actually, what's the question that you're asking this lady to make a decision about? So for me, what I kind of, from the information I got, I kind of felt that what you were asking her was, what would I like to do? What activities would I like to try? So that's really good. We've identified the question. From the information we got, we kind of know that this lady can communicate with simple objects of reference and kind of non-verbal communication. And again, the objects of reference can support her understanding. And what I kind of took from it is that also experiences will support her understanding. So what are our next steps? We need to look at her will and preference. Okay, we need to look at what this lady has liked in the past, what her preferences were. Does she have sensory preferences? Does she have environmental preferences? Does she have preferences for the people around her? And how that might inform any activities that she's exposed to. So for example, if this lady loves being outside and loves animals, what about something like llama walking or dog therapy and things like that? So there's a few different options you could suggest which would be in line with her preferences. And then because her understanding is really supported by experiencing those, why don't we just give things a try? So she could try these different activities and monitor her response to them over time. So we might not like it on the first visit, but maybe the second or third we might do. So it's also important to kind of have those repeated experiences for this lady. And then it's just to kind of act on that. So once we've kind of gathered that information, we can then really kind of pin down what activities this lady might like. And that would be part of the decision made. So hopefully she'll be able to answer that. And I'm hoping that's clear. The last slide is just a review of Jo Watson's framework and about kind of the process that we go through together. So for me, it's the identifying the decision. So what is the question that you're asking? Listen together, explore the options, document it together, and make those decisions and act on them. So that would be kind of the framework that I would be working through in order to support decision-making for people who have higher support needs and maybe don't communicate formally. That's okay. I did notice that there are a few more questions, so hopefully we'll get to those.
Great. Thank you so much, Amy and Tara. Absolutely wonderful presentations. We're getting a lot of feedback in the chat about the real life examples and how important that is. And I think we can all, that's absolutely what we need to bring this back to real world circumstances for people and how we can support people and tease through situations and be respectful and honor people's communication at the same time. I'm just conscious of time and we only have a few minutes left this afternoon. This is obviously a topic that we could spend days on, and just to say that at Inclusion Ireland, we will be building on this topic over the next few months. So this isn't the only seminar that we'll have relevant for people with higher support needs or who are non-speaking. So please do stay in touch with us and stay connected with us after the seminar. So I know I'm conscious there's a couple of questions that came through in the chat that we weren't able to answer just through text. So I know, Eleanor, you were going to take one or two of those questions. We probably have a couple of minutes for you to just give an answer there, if that's okay. And then we'll be ready to finish up within the next few minutes. Thanks, Eleanor.
No problem. So yeah, I have some thoughts on the questions about the potentially onerous nature of the decision-making representative role. And so what I would say here is that, again, if you weren't rushing off to have this person, to have somebody made a ward of court under the previous system, then the same principles apply. Don't rush off to go to court to get the authority to make decisions for someone. And we never want to do that for anyone unless it's absolutely necessary, and it might be necessary in some very limited cases. But even for people with really significant disabilities, why can't we use the other options would be my first question. Why can't we use the decision-making assistance agreement? Why can't the person create a co-decision-making agreement? And really explore those, because I think that though obviously there is no reporting requirement, for example, under the decision-making assistance agreement. So there is no onerous obligations there. And like, I think it's really important that, you know, whenever somebody is interacting with the external world, which we all do, you know, whether it's a bank or a doctor or somebody else, where support to communicate their wishes is needed, those people will look to the person who understands the person, as they're always doing now, and saying, you know, what is the person trying to say here? Do I have their consent to go ahead, or should I be doing this? And that will continue. So again, no formal option is necessary under the Act, especially for things like the right to vote. Like there is nobody is going to, I mean, again, perhaps there have been instances, I know there have been instances of people being challenged at polling stations and things like that, which is really inappropriate and is not provided for in our law at all. But again, all of this stuff is what people would naturally do with a family member, and the documenting of it is only to satisfy people outside who don't know the person, that we're not just making this up, we're not, you know, inventing what we say the person is telling you here. It's to have that backup, so that whenever the person has to interact with people that aren't you, that those other people have a basis for understanding what's going on. So I would really, you know, make sure to emphasize that people should not feel like they absolutely now need to go and be made a decision-making representative for a non-speaking person. You should, you know, really explore, is any option needed? Maybe no option is needed. Maybe things can continue as before. If an option is needed, why can't a more flexible option kind of go ahead? And I think I would really push strongly that the Act was intended that as many people as possible would have the most flexible options available and retain the highest level of their own decision-making autonomy. So yeah, I think that's what I would say there. I know there was also a question about the capacity of the courts to respond. And again, I can't speak for the courts. And I know that there has been a lot of work done in this area to try to figure out how that would be, how cases would be prioritized and so on. And people will have an entitlement to legal aid for those proceedings. But again, I would really emphasize that, like, why do we need to go to court? Do we absolutely need to go? Or is there a way to use one of the more flexible options under the Act, or just rely on the presumption of capacity, which again is embedded, it's in the guiding principles under the Act. Every person who interacts with someone must presume their capacity. And so other people around them can support the expression of their will and preferences instead. I think there was a question about someone who was refusing medication as well. And again, I mean, I suppose it's a tricky situation, but you know, the same principles always apply, that you know, the person does not want to do this. So we can all be really nervous for people in our lives where we think they're making bad decisions or decisions that are going to be really resulting in really serious consequences for them. So, you know, what other alternatives could be explored that might support the person instead, because plenty of people are uncomfortable with taking medication. So we have to try to figure out, what is the person willing to do, what works well for them, how can they be supported to make sure those preferences are respected, and not impose our own judgment, which again is very easy for us to do, just to, you know, think that, oh gosh, but like we're being told that they need this, and if they don't have it, things are going to be really terrible. But sometimes people need, and from other research on supported decision making, like Cher Nicholson's project in South Australia, she really demonstrated how for the first time people experienced not have, you know, a parent, for example, deciding that they would go to hospital now or be medicated now. And so they actually got to physically experience what it was like in their body to be at that level, and learned for themselves, oh, that's the level that when I've reached now I need to make decisions. And of course, it would be great if I had made that decision 10 minutes ago or 2 weeks ago, but now I know that for myself, I will be able to tell that in the future. And that's a really valuable learning experience that really shouldn't be undermined as well. So I think those were my initial thoughts, and I don't know how much time we have to go into some of the other things.
Yeah, unfortunately we are running close to out of time, but thank you so much, Eleanor, for addressing those very important questions. And I think it is, like, it's really reassuring people to kind of bust some of the myths around the Act. And it really, as you have said, it's about do we need this part of it at all? Do we need to go to court? And really, really reflecting on that. And I suppose relying on a relationship with the individual and really supporting that person to express their will and preference. So it is about bringing it back to that relationship again. So thanks for that. And as I said, we'll need many more conversations in this space over the next few months, and things are going to grow and evolve and shape as the Decision Support Service opens its doors as well. So we will all be learning together. And I suppose at Inclusion Ireland, we're mindful of that this isn't a once-off seminar. This is something that we'll come back to time and time again. And there might be more questions down the road as things evolve. Just to say, to finish up from my perspective before I hand over to Angela, today we won't have answered all of your questions because, there are many questions in this space and there's many different perspectives about decision making, and particularly for people with higher support needs. But I hope we've started the journey of exploring some of that. And thank you so much to the panelists who have shared their expertise and their knowledge. We'll be in contact with everybody after the seminar to share some additional resources. There are other webinars out there, and we can also send you some links and that, etc., if you'd find that useful. We are planning on hosting another webinar down the road on the use of alternative and augmentative communication as a human right. And I suppose my open-ended question as I come to the end of this webinar is, what more can we do as allies of people who are non-speaking? And we really want your thoughts around this and your perspective. We want to listen and we want to respond. And it's so heartening to me, the amount of people who've turned up for this webinar this afternoon, because that means there are allies out there, there are supporters, there are people who really, really care about this. So how do we build on that, and how do we become even better allies? And you can get in touch with us at info@inclusionireland.ie with your ideas about that, or anything that we can do better at Inclusion Ireland or do more of. So just to finish up, I'm going to hand you over to Angela, who's going to share just her reflections on this afternoon to wrap up our session together. And thank you all for attending. And I'll just hand you over to Angela for the final few words.
Thank you, Derval, and thank you so much to all the speakers from today. It's so great to learn so many new things all the time. And as has been said already, this is a whole process and there's so much to learn around this subject. But I think that the communication piece is such a good foundation. And I particularly liked Amy's words about building a relationship and taking time and learning how to communicate with people. So yeah, I think it's just really important for people to keep giving that feedback as well, because I know when I'm listening to all these things, I want to, when I think about my own communication style, I can't ask questions straight away. I have to have a good think about it and process it. So I'll be asking a lot of questions later of the panel as well. I'll be emailing them myself. But from what you guys have said today, two important questions that I want to ask myself afterwards is about how do I communicate and how do I get support to communicate my decisions, my choices, my opinions when I require support to do so. So yeah, I think just thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, Angela, for that. Thank you, everybody. That completes our webinar this afternoon, and we'll be in touch with you all soon. Thanks to our panelists. Take care.